It's good to go.
I guess we're recording. Good afternoon and welcome to Planning for the Future PD 2034. I'm Adam Powell. I'm Director of Planning Programs for the USC Annenberg Center for Communication, Leadership, and Policy. This is part of a mid-month public diplomacy series, which is in addition to First Monday programs, which have been going on now for more than 10 years in partnership with the Public Diplomacy Council of America, George Washington University, and today with the USC Center on Public Diplomacy. This program is being recorded and it is on the record. The video will be available later on the PDCA website. Our next program in this room will be Wednesday at 2 p.m., Campaign 2024, looking ahead to the debate, the conventions, and much more. It'll be at 2 p.m. here. And then next week, we have two Africa programs. I know many of you come to those. On Monday at 9 a.m., our monthly Africa-US Forums topic will be Perspectives from Africa on the Future of International Population and Development Policy. And we also have a two-day program, virtual only, Wednesday and Thursday, on Africa, artificial intelligence, elections, and the future of democracy, with a number of African universities participating. So now, please welcome our moderator for today, Ambassador Larry Wallers, the Vice President of the Public Diplomacy Council of America. Larry, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks very much. And just a quick flag that everybody, please turn your phones off if you haven't already done so. Welcome to the special session of PDCA's Speaker Forum. I'm Larry Wallers, the moderator, and we are delighted to have with us today Paul Kruchoski, the Director of the Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, Office of Policy Planning and Resources. A hefty title, but it has a hefty mandate. For those of you who aren't familiar with the state organizational chart, RIPPER, as it's known inside the building, supports the sector by coordinating feeding policy, equipping practitioners with the knowledge and skills they need, developing performance metrics, and managing a $1.5 billion public diplomacy budget. It's also something that's growing rapidly. When I was chief of staff in R 15 years ago, RIPPER's total staff was, I believe, five. And how many are you now?
For about 190.
Well, it has grown, and for good reason, as Paul has explained today. But first, a little context about today's program. I'd like to take an historical view of PD because my father joined the U.S. Information Service 6 months before the agency was created. And I have a daughter who's still in public diplomacy, so I've got a 70-year perspective. And in all that time, the central challenge of being a PD practitioner was the enormous gap between our mission and the resources at our disposal. I say our, even though I'm retired, still mine. But imagine, if the U.S. Navy had just one aircraft carrier instead of 11, but still had the same mission. How do you do that? How do you think about your mission? And that's why the best PD practitioners I've known over the decades have been masters of the arts of being strategic thinkers, innovators, but also very practical and hard-nosed, have to do it all. And as Paul knows, that's really hard to do. And that challenge has become even greater in the last few decades. On the one hand, real resources have declined substantially. And on the other hand, technology and social media have increased exponentially the ability of other actors, state and non-state, to compete to engage and shape audience perceptions. In short, the only certainties about the conduct of PD over the next 10 years, which is the topic that Paul is going to address today, is that it's going to continue to change and there will never be enough resources. So that's sort of enough to make one think we should just give up. But PDCA has not given up, and that's why we are here and having this program today. And Paul Kruchoski is really important person for us to have speak to us today. As someone who's been thinking creatively and strategically about this. For years, we first met 10 years ago, something,
Yeah.
something of that time. And even then, you were thinking about innovation, and thinking about the need for structure and doctrine that would bring PD practitioners together. And I won't go through all of his bio. You have it there, but suffice to say, he's been thinking about these issues for most of 10 years. Coincidentally, Paul also has an article in this month's Foreign Service Journal entitled An AI Primer for Policy Professionals, which is very appropriate to what we're talking about today, and I recommend it to you. So, Paul, without further ado, I hand you the floor.
Excellent. And I am going to take a moment and bring slides up. Because what would be a conversation about the future without a slide deck? So, hi everyone. Thanks to both USC as well as EDCA for hosting me today. This is a topic that I care very deeply about, as many of you who have worked with me know. How can we continue to make PD better and prepare ourselves for what comes? But this was also a very good forcing mechanism for me to get some thoughts down on paper ahead of this, because the future is one of those things that's always coming. And if you don't spend time forcing yourself to think about it, you don't prepare. I want to do just a very brief review for folks on what we look like in the PD family today, as well as how Ripper sits in it. And to your point, why did we grow so big? Why did we end up with Ripper the size and structure it has today? Today we have an undersecretary, hooray, a Senate confirmed one. We don't always have that joy. And then we have these four primary constituent entities: the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs, the Bureau of Global Public Affairs, that was really the byproduct of the reorganization in 2019, where IIP moved its media components into GPA. So we had a single communications focused entity, the Global Engagement Center with its focus on counter state and non-state propaganda and disinformation. And then Ripper, the Office of Policy Planning and Resources. And one of the kind of interesting things that happened in that 2019 merger and realignment is IIP had a whole bunch of things in it that were not really about communication, right? There were other forms of supporting our practitioners in the field. And a lot of those ended up coming to Ripper and getting combined with a lot of the other nascent field support entities that had been created when Tanya was there, when Greta was there, and many of the rest of us who have served in Ripper. Because as you'll hear me talk about today, I'm a pretty firm believer, as most of us are in Ripper, that PD is still fundamentally about relationships and relationships that happen abroad. But the work of PD has gotten hard, and people need a lot of infrastructure to support them in doing that work effectively today. And when you look at how we think about the role of Ripper today, you see a lot of that in there, right? These kind of three core roles that we play: securing and aligning resources. I spend a lot of time up on the Hill talking to our colleagues about where we are, what we need, and where we're going next. Building collaboration across the interagency and with our allies and partners so that we are working toward common effect. And I see several people in the audience already who have worked on some of that with us, making sure that DoD and our other colleagues are rowing in the same direction as us to support our PD practitioners around the world in the practice of modern public diplomacy, which I'll talk about a little more. And then one that's a kind of interesting anomaly is we're also the home of the World Expos and the National Museum of American Diplomacy, which are these kind of flagship presences that tell our story both to the American public in the case of the museum, but also to a global public in the case of our World Expos. And we are deep in the preparation process for the Osaka World Expo 2025 right now, where we expect to see well north of 20 million people. So with that, I would be remiss if I started a conversation about the future of PD without talking about the past of PD. And this was a really good moment to think about, where were we 10 years ago in 2014, about the time I met you, Larry. And out there in the world, here are some of the things that were really the hallmarks of that year. We had a growing refugee crisis, particularly in the Middle East. Sadly, that has not changed 10 years later. Russia annexes Crimea. Okay, some more things that are continuity from past to present. We had pro-democracy protests erupting in Hong Kong in the first of what ended up being really the curtailment of democracy there. And you see a lot of things that are continuations of threads through to present. And in PD, here's a little snapshot of where we were. We were just in the process of our colleagues in IIP in particular promulgating the idea of campaign-driven public diplomacy rather than single activities, single engagements, trying to figure out how you knit it together. We had essentially no audience segmentation. There was very, very limited audience research available outside of the work that the INR Bureau did through the opinion polling operation that they ran. We had no program evaluation capacity to speak of. Congress was really on our case then about figuring out how we can do things like randomized controlled trials, do real outcome assessments of public diplomacy, to be able to tell them what works and what doesn't based on something other than gut feeling. And when you look forward to how we have changed over the last 10 years, if this sounds a little foreign, the policy issues are not foreign, but the way we do public diplomacy is very, very different than it was 10 years ago. Between then and now, we conducted the very first strategic resource review, which was a comprehensive look at all of our public diplomacy resources to understand what's the mission that public diplomacy is being asked to do today? What are the resources we have to do it? How well aligned those resources are with the mission? And out of that, we came up with a couple of really startling conclusions. One of which was, when we look at the mission, to fully accomplish it, we would need twice the resources we have today. Which, to your point in your introduction, Larry, I don't think is intuitively hard for us to grasp. When you look at the numbers, though, it's a very, very stark gap. And I highlight this because at the same time that those challenges out there in the world haven't changed, the resourcing is not matched to them. The work of public diplomacy itself has gotten a lot more complicated. And there are a couple of reasons why, right? One of which is we face state and non-state actors who really, really care about the information and influence space today. Our best estimates are that Russia spends about the same that we do on overt public-facing public communication. Our best guess is that China spends, the PRC spends 4 to 5 times as much as we do. Our resources are dwarfed, and we have a greater attention from some of those actors than many others. But we also are competing not just with state actors, but every other draw on people's attention, affinity, and identity. And if you look at how corporations, if you look at how civil society is drawing on those things, they have a really sophisticated toolkit today. And I think one of the things that technology has really changed for us is it's closed the gap between large institutions like the State Department and what someone at home can do with a set of AI and other technology-enabled tools to run really sophisticated campaigns. Resources still matter, but the gap is a whole lot smaller, right? And one of the things that people out there in the world, if they're running solo campaigns, don't have is the clearance process, right? Speed is almost never going to be on our side for some of that in public diplomacy. So we have to think about the benefits of our work in different ways. If you look at these priorities for Undersecretary Allen, you will see a lot of continuity with what I talked about a few minutes ago, right? The PRC challenge remains top of mind. particularly with the incredible level of both the volume of work, but also the particular ways that they're going after some of the information spaces around the world. The core challenges that exist in the information space, the need to both communicate with the American public about the work that the department does, but also maintain a degree of cohesion of our domestic coalitions for the work that we do. And then actually getting to investing in the workforce and preparing them for what is. Because public diplomacy is really hard today, right? For those of you who are in active service, how many of you feel like it's an easier job to do today than it was 5 years ago? Yeah, I see shaking of heads in the back of the room here, right? It's not easier. The challenges only continue to mount, both because of the technological problems, but also we just happen to live in a world where the core elements of power have moved away from being concentrated in large organizations to being much more diffuse. Right? And you see this dynamic in pretty much every sector where people and networks are much more powerful than they were a decade ago or 2 decades ago or 3 decades ago. And the challenge for us in PD is that makes public diplomacy a much more valuable part of the diplomatic pool. Because every single one of these issues that we work on, counter PRC, protecting the information environment, global health, supporting NATO and our alliances, you need public support to move forward the agenda on pretty much anything you work on. So public diplomacy matters, and it's harder, and we don't have enough resources. What a great place for us to be, everyone. Right? So what do we do about that? And so I want to talk a little bit now in 2 parts, now that I've done the exposition, about what is the same, and then where I think we need to evolve and change. And as I thought ahead of this talk about what's the same, there's a lot of our tradecraft that fundamentally is different. Audiences matter. Being clear about what you're trying to do matters. Really getting serious about understanding success and failure matters a lot. And actually having a creative point of view makes a huge difference. Does anyone remember any State Department tweets? What are the tweets that you remember?
Maybe the ones that were funny for me, but maybe not for the rest of the audience. Like when you go abroad, if you're not with kind of the United States, you're not going to be a 10 abroad. Don't get scammed. Yeah.
So this wonderful kind of edgy campaign that Consular Affairs ran that got them into a little bit of trouble. People tend to remember like the haggis eating video from COP when it was in Scotland. Let's take embassy officers and get them to eat Scottish food on film. People remember some really memorable social media content out at Embassy Kyiv in the early days of the war, reaffirming a lot of Ukraine's identity and history. We remember edgy stuff, right? And when you look at the attention economy today, the world in which we live, that creative point of view matters. And it matters in light of these other things too, right? So we're not in a world where we can reach everyone with the resources that we have. And frankly, I don't think we've ever been. I don't think we've ever been in a place where the technology and our budget support us reaching everyone in the Indian subcontinent, for instance. So we have to choose. And what I think is distinct about the time that we're in now is our PD practitioners are getting increasingly good at thinking through what this audience segmentation looks like, defining who they matter, who matters to them and why. Vanya, do you remember what the most common audience was in the PDIP, the Public Diplomacy Implementation Plan, when you were in River almost a decade ago?
I think that was a height of young people.
Yes, youth, women, and the general public were the 3 most common audiences. That is not where we are. And when you look at people's faces wrinkling in this room, you can tell how we have moved on that. But really understanding who matters and why we need to develop relationships is really at the core of what we do. 2, being able to understand where we are and where we want to go is, I think, kind of the central planning question to your point about being ruthlessly strategic, right? If we can't do everything, where can we reasonably move people? And I think something you see all of our PD practitioners doing a better and better job of saying, can we actually move this with the tools that we have? And if we can't, let's not try. Let's not throw good resources after bad, or throw too little resources where we're trying to achieve too much. And that's informed by thinking about actually understanding what the evidence base is. And this, I think, has been one of the biggest transformations over the last 10 years, is we have PD practitioners who are really literate in what data they have, using A/B testing when they're doing marketing, using previous evaluations to inform the work that they are doing now. And I think really critical in the State Department environment, admitting that some things do not work and did not work. Things fail. And we can learn as much, if not more than from failure than we can from success, right? And last, the fundamental that I started with, the creative content, right? Being able to have a creative point of view. Not everyone has to agree, and not everything is going to work for every audience. But when you think about what you need to do, who your audiences are, what works, that gives you some space to take some creative liberties, to take some smart bets. And I think really critically to set some things down, because there is no way for us to do everything for everyone all the time. So you may say, great, like strategic planning doesn't actually help us get all the way there. Being thoughtful about what does and doesn't work doesn't help us get all the way there. Being focused on audiences, there are still more audiences that we need to reach than we're ever going to be able to. That's great. All of this stuff is what people are doing, and it's the table stakes for where we go next. If we can't talk about audiences, if we can't think about data, if we can't be clear about what our goals are, we're not going to be able to be successful either in a new technological landscape, but we're not going to be successful in where we were 5 years ago. There's just no way for us to do our work without doing all of those things well. But then that raises the question of like, where do we go next? And how do we think about dealing with that colossal challenge that we have in front of us? For me, the public diplomacy of tomorrow starts with one of the places that we started more than 70 years ago in public diplomacy. This is a very, very famous line from Archibald MacLeish, who, of course, was the Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs, which was essentially a public diplomacy umbrella at one time, moved through ECA, and then wrote in the UNESCO Constitution this line at the beginning: "Since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be constructed." It's not really about information or content at its core. Our business is about relationships. And everything that I just ran through in my previous slides was about how you decide what relationships matter and what you want to put into them. But then we have this other colossal problem, which is that our public diplomats today don't spend nearly enough time on the relationships. They spend a whole lot of time on everything else. Travel orders. For anyone who's suffered through the wonders of E2 in the last 20 years, you know that it takes you nearly as much time to put yourself on an airplane as it does to run an entire PD program sometimes. The amount of paperwork that we have for grants compliance mounts and mounts and mounts. Managing the social media landscape that we live in is more complex than it ever has been before. And for me, the guiding principle for the next 10 years has to be, how do we help people build and sustain the relationships and find ways to use the robots and technology to do everything else? A new public diplomacy officer overseas now costs us $700,000 a year, which is no small sum when we're talking about consumer budgets. So for every hour that we are putting someone overseas through doing work for Washington or to feed an administrative process, that's not just time we're never going to get back from highly experienced people that are hard to replace, but it's also incredibly financially costly for us. So, at a time when frankly, I don't think that we have the resources to be able to do that. So we have to enable our people, our local staff, our American officers to do that. And then we have to get serious about automating basically everything else. Everything else can, and everything that can be automated should be. And that means that we're going to have to take some technological risks along the way, right? Not every system we use will be 100% secure at every moment in time. I think that's probably fine since most of it is going out for core consumption anyway. And then the back-end processes, we have to take a really careful comb over to make sure that we're thinking about what we can use them for. I think AI is kind of the starting place of that conversation for a lot of us today. But I don't think it's actually the heart of it, right? Because AI is only as good as the data and information that you put into it. And let's face it, the data and information that we have as a diplomatic community is not always great. But all of those things I showed you in the PD Today section are what is setting up PD to really take advantage of a lot of the AI and generative systems in a way that other parts of the diplomatic community are not, right? We have more robust audience data. We've spent time understanding who our audience segments are. We've spent time collecting and monitoring and evaluation data, program data, building a enterprise-wide content management system, teaching people how to use these things. But PD is sitting on a treasure trove of data as a result. And that means that as we get a lot of these tools online, we actually have the potential to start to use some of the computers to do the work that we frankly don't need to do. And you can kind of pull that into two camps, right? The things that make us more efficient. Press clips is one of my favorite ones. If anyone has watched some of our embassies do press clips, looking at you, Sarah, so I'm thinking about our fun friends at one of our posts in the Pacific in East Asia that has a whole team that just runs press clips every day. 3 or 4 people who really just manage pulling that together. Well, our wonderful colleagues in the Bureau of Global Public Affairs built a tool that scrapes billions of data, billions of individual news articles every day, compiles them, and then stacks an AI summarization layer on top of that. How many tens of thousands of hours can we return of people to doing relationship-driven work as a result of that? Same with figuring out things like keeping contacts and relationships fresh. We all manage relationships and we all have to go through the process of understanding when we talk to people, what we talk to them about, and when we need to get back in touch with them. Store that in a database. It's really easy to automate those reminders to get back in touch, right? And to be able to keep relationships fresh in the right ways. Those are places where we can pull some of that busy, winding work off people, even before we get to the point of touching things like the travel systems that are not within our control and safety. But we can pull on some of those kind of lower value tasks that enable us to do some of the higher order work and give people some time back. And then there's this whole other set of things that computers do far better than we do that allow us to enhance the capabilities we have today. And I think about some that are already live out there where you can, just a couple of weeks ago, I was coaching one of our hosts on how they might formulate some campaigns within the ambassador in place. I had their integrated country strategy and their public diplomacy implementation plan. I had the recent opinion polling that we did for them. And I had our PD foundations or doctrinal model. I gave all of those things to a custom trained ChatGPT and said, based on the goals and the audience data, where do you think there are opportunities for this embassy to do work in the next 12 months? And the answer that it gave me, analyzing that roughly 500 pages of documentation, was roughly the same that my own team gave me back. Because a lot of the new AI applications are much better suited to do that large purpose analysis, much better suited than we are, right? They can hold the large data sets in processing in a way that most of our brains just don't do. I think the real opportunity for us is to use both of those, right? If we can pull some of that deep thinking work off to enable people to do the relational part of it, if we can pull some of the low value work off, we actually have this promise of returning our public diplomacy officers to people who can spend time out in the field. Now, as kind of my coda here, before we get into discussion and Q&A, all of this lives in the cloud now, right? It's not bound to OpenNet. It's not bound to computers in an embassy site or in a chancery in most countries around the world. If we're paying money to send people abroad, this opens up the possibility of people doing work in more places than they ever have before, right? If you don't need a huge in-person infrastructure, the computer is aiding you in doing a lot of it. What a great opportunity to think about people being in secondary cities, in people being able to get out and about a little bit more, because the thinking can happen here in real time. And it can be aided by less administrative work that's done manually on paper along the way. Wouldn't it be great if we could get people out permanently to all of those secondary cities in Nigeria, or to a much wider range of secondary cities in India than we are today? The potential for actually figuring out that people can matter to building alliances and partnerships seems like an opportunity well worth taking the time to seize. I'll end with kind of a counterfactual, which is I think all of us feel the pressure from the PRC in particular today. Do we think that they're not thinking about this and not thinking about doing these same things? If we're not thinking about how we use our technology to build relationships the way we want, the relational space is likely to be flooded by things that I think not just we don't like, but many of our partners don't like either. One of the things that I hear most consistently in foreign governments when I talk to civil society is they do want a partnership with the United States, but that requires that we show up and do that relationship building. They don't want a transactional relationship, as so many of those, some of our other competitors are. They're transactional, they're not deep. That requires us to show up. When it comes to our ability to compete and ultimately to let some of the ideas that we care most deeply live and flourish in the world, we have to think about how we use some of these new opportunities in front of us. The opportunity is frankly, I think, too great for us to give up on this. With that, why don't we talk?
Okay, thank you very much. A fascinating discussion. You're going to get a number of questions.
I'm sure.
So let me jump in and ask the first one about particularly this last one and about China and AI. I was listening to a podcast with an expert on the evolution of AI, and he was saying that at the behest of the Chinese government, Chinese universities have already created over 700 academic programs specifically focused on AI. With the intent to be able to flood every conceivable market with a lot of pretty cheap AI practitioners. Can we compete with that? What do we have to do? It's just an ordinary framework. And then the second question is this: I completely understand the idea of using data sets to create good AI programs, but your AI programs are only as good as the data sets. What happens to our officers in posts like, for example, Central African Republic, where those data sets really aren't there? How do you factor that into the equation?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with the second part and then move to the broader AI competition after that. So there's always going to be disparate quality of data, but I think frankly, so much of the data that we care about is not externally collected things. It's actually things we can do ourselves, right?
Mhm.
And I think that's largely a question of, are you collecting good contact data? Are you thinking about what 2 or 3 questions you need to intentionally ask to continue to gather that data when you're interacting with people digitally and in person?
Mhm.
What we need is a vast troves in many cases for each individual country. It's good to have big data sets and aggregate them. You know, you can get by with relatively limited data and still get some really good stuff out of a lot of the systems that exist. And then on things like opinion polling, both we and I are great at opinion polling at some of the most far-flung places on earth. So I think we probably have more than enough to meet most people's needs. On AI more generally, yeah, we have to compete, and I think we can, both as a country and society. But I think kind of 2 fundamental things, 3 things will give the US an edge. People still want to come here to work on doing AI work in the United States rather than in China. US models for AI, I'll invert these 2 points. Truth really matters for AI, right? True and accurate information that you are building on. The more ideological points you introduce into the AI model, the less good it is going to be. And the less valuable it's going to be on the consumer market. And I think the US system and US companies are going to continue to have an edge there. And I don't think that's going away. I think that's structural. I do think that one of the things you will see with AI systems over the next couple of years, if not next months, is more and more people building them within walled gardens, right? OpenAI trained on the open internet is not going to be the only thing that is out there or the most valuable thing in the future. And you can see both the financial industry and health industry way out ahead on that. They're building things where they can, for themselves, that they can rely on with data that they know they can trust. And I think that trusting the data that is used to train the AI models is going to be one of the fundamental dynamics that plays out over the next couple of years, both in broader AI work, but also in what we're doing here in state, right?
Okay, I'll open up to questions from the audience and then move to the chat room. Tanya.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Paul. Continuing a little bit on the staffing question, a double part looking at working level staffing and then leadership. At the working level, in order to get to where we are, for example, on monitoring and evaluation, we had to hire specialized people with training. 10 years on, 15 years on, how is the regular intake system, the Foreign Service Officer test and regular civil service hiring? Are those 2 systems able to bring in not just the technological expertise, but also this, the curiosity, is that you do? So in the working level, the second thing, one of the slides referred to a leadership commitment to this principles of public diplomacy, to this data-driven public diplomacy. Have we codified that so that we survive every 4-year switches?
Yeah, and so I'll start there and then move back to kind of broader hiring. So we have been, when we're talking about leadership, we are not talking about executive leadership on that slide. We're talking about individual posts, the PAO, the public diplomacy officers, the heads of the regional public diplomacy offices. We've been tracking data on that for a number of years now. We started doing a global public diplomacy survey, I think in 2018 or 2019. And the numbers have steadily crept up on that importance of data among both our officer corps as well as our local staff corps. Local staff are ahead of American officers on that one, which doesn't surprise me. But you see that usage rate and that attitude continue to track up over time, which is exactly the thing that I would hope to see, it becoming institutionalized, and institutionalized for the right reasons, right? Which is not, my boss told me I need to do this, but it makes me better at my job. And it makes me able to make better choices enables me to make better arguments to our leadership about what we should and should not do. So on regular hiring, I think we have done a good job of kind of diversifying a lot of the types of people we're hiring. And I think we still get a good variety of creative points of view. I think the real challenge remains having a system in place that by the time you're 10 or 15 years in, you still feel like you are able to take some of those bigger risks. And I really appreciate that that's a place where the department leadership has really made a point in the broader modernization work that the Deputy Secretary for Management and Resources leads. Having a more risk tolerant risk posture really matters. And it matters in PD far more than it does in other places. In part because, frankly, the stakes aren't always as high for us. So we should be able to take a little bit more risk, and we have to. We've gotten nothing but support for that for the last 6-7 years. And that is bipartisan, it is cross administration. It's something that almost everyone has recognized. That it's a hard and scary thing to tell people they can take risks and not know when you jump off that cliff if you're going to get caught or not. You have to have a really good track record of watching people jump off the cliff and get pulled up before you feel prepared to take the same leap.
Thanks, Paul. Obviously, I'm a global citizen, but I'm an African descendant. So as you're speaking, I'm just walking with you, then you drop Nigeria, you drop India, now we're talking, we're looking east. And I was thinking, you also mentioned trust in the data. And immediately I was also thinking trust in American public diplomacy. Yeah. For the sake of cohesion, yeah, especially with international and foreign public diplomacy departments, in what practical ways and practical initiatives are you going to work together to facilitate so that not just that America stays ahead, which is obviously a valid source of pride, but that the rest of the world walks with. And over the years, over the decades working, I know it's personal experience. Once I start working on anything American, immediately the rest of my colleagues are left behind. And I'm thinking, it's a stigma. How do I get everyone to work with me here? For the sake of cohesion, how can diplomacy be indeed based on international laws, we'll say comedy, being on the same ground, on the same, just that reassurance in the culture and the trust that we're actually working together, those initiatives, that's what I'm trying to figure out. And not to put you on the spot, but I'm just thinking that in future, it would help you by it. Yeah.
So a couple of, going back to some true fundamentals about the US approach, right? So every country that does public diplomacy does it a little bit differently, whether it's France, the UK, Russia, the PRC, Australia, and has a different mix and different principles underlie it. The very first thing in the original public diplomacy mission statement is understanding. The role of public diplomacy is to understand, influence foreign publics, and build relationships. It's the formulation that's been there for probably 30 years. And two of the things that public diplomacy officers do around the world that are really, I think, foundational to the way we think about work is we're clear about what we're trying to do, including the people that we're doing it with, right? We don't hide that it's a US public diplomacy program, even if it might be easier if we did, sometimes. And we do things with people, right? When you look at a program like Fulbright or a program like the International Visitor Leadership Program, they aren't about things that we are trying to do to people, they're things that we are trying to do with them. And sometimes you're starting from a place of not a lot of trust. Sometimes you have to build that trust first, really slowly and painstakingly, especially if people disagree or don't believe some of the things that you're trying to say. That's part of the job. as figuring out how you do that and you use the right mix of things. I on my slide earlier, like I'm quite serious that we are an actor working on global challenges. We're working on global challenges that we think we have a lot of friends on, right? And you have to start from that place of, it isn't about defeating Russia or China per se, it's about advancing an agenda of our own. And that agenda includes things like dealing with energy security, dealing with environmental security, dealing with the issues of providing democratic and representative forms of government that allow people to have their voices heard. Not everyone's going to agree on those. That's not about us imposing solutions. It's about finding ways that we work together. I think is built into kind of the underlying approach from the beginning.
Excellent.
Back here.
Hi, thank you so much.
Yeah.
My name is Natalie. I just finished my thesis on AI diplomacy and regulation. So I love everything you're saying about how we can better optimize using LLMs and such. My question is related to, in the beginning, you were talking about how much the organization has grown, put up kind of an org chart. As we're in this AI kind of revolution, some jobs will go away, some jobs will evolve, there will be new jobs. How would you like to see it change, in the next 10 years, if you're giving this talk and saying, okay, here's what we're looking at, here's some of the organizations, here's some of the skills that, that we're seeing in the jobs. What would you like that to look like, or what's your vision for that?
Yeah. So a couple of things. One, I don't think our actual staffing footprint itself, we the global public diplomacy staffing footprint, is going to change a lot in terms of numbers. What I think you will see is what we do in terms of skills and the balance between people who are supporting the back end and supporting the front end, right? And my goal is to hollow out the inside so we can continue to push people out. For frontline practitioners, that means getting relatively comfortable with living in a hybrid environment, right? Doing hybrid work where it is human plus machine, and getting very comfortable with your watch or whatever else being something that enables pushes work, like pushes pieces of your work to you. And really being ruthless ourselves with the hardest part of the low value work equation, which is, I think, most of low value work in bureaucracies is things we've created for ourselves. The number of novels written about the plagues of bureaucracy don't come out of nowhere, right? And I think that is the place where we're most likely to have risk of failure, is our own willingness to let go of the things that we think we need that are our security blankets, but we don't actually. And take a leap into that new world. I think what this means for us in terms of practitioners is twofold more, right? One, we have to spend a lot of time training and getting smart on us and learning, training and learning, training and learning, with an emphasis on the L, not the T, right? And the kind of secondary part of that is being comfortable with the change and mutability of our jobs. All of us have just gone through a long period of restructuring under the public diplomacy staffing initiative. Largely done, hooray. And the thing that I've told teams as we talk to them is, we're done with that piece of change. That does not mean we're done with change. And if we try to not change the way we work in public diplomacy and hold on to where we are at this moment, it's going to make us 10 years from now have some really traumatic and difficult changes that we have to make all at once to kind of catch up. That incremental change is going to be really important. And it's also going to be really hard, right? Because we don't always know where we're.
One more question, Louise?
I have 4 questions.
Oh,
Okay.
I do want to get to the
My
chat.
first question is, okay, you're mining data. Whose data are you mining? You must have data sets for individual countries. And then you give a contract to Google or Gmail address holders or AOL or Instagram, what?
The easy answer is no, we do not buy any external data.
Okay.
The places that we do data, we collect things ourselves. Where people have given it to us and responding to like a program evaluation or
Okay.
something else. Or we're commissioning opinion polls the same way.
So it's taking you a while to build up your own database.
Yes, of
Yeah.
course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, are you using any apps to monitor data in each country on, I don't know, trigger words that trigger off algorithms to say that was the response to a tweet or a Facebook
we-
posting?
We have a whole collection of stuff.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah,
Are you
yeah,
doing
yeah.
it in-house or do you contract that out?
Buying mostly commercial off the shelf.
Okay. That's very interesting. Are you doing anything, do you have any clever ways of getting around censorship? In China for a while, VPNs could
Yeah.
allow people to access the American embassy, social media.
The short answer is yes. The longer answer is, I can tell you someplace where I might be able to move it.
Say it again.
Oh, we have a live
Classified.
feed.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
okay. Okay, I just wondered about this. I remember when, now, in some countries, do you actually have governments trying to avoid, prevent USG social media comments penetrating that country?
Well, of course.
Okay.
Yes, that's been true for
Decades.
a long time.
And so you have ways around that sometimes.
We always find ways to engage.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay.
Yes, thank you very much. Back when I was working more directly on public diplomacy, I know we talked about an interagency approach, working with other US government agencies, and particularly DoD,
Yes.
and both the message, but also in the way in which we do public diplomacy. And I'm wondering if that is still something that you're working on,
Yes.
and particularly what you're doing in that space, both
Yep.
on the message, which I know it has to be well coordinated, but also in the method.
Yeah, so I have a wonderful colleague who can disclose her presence later if she so desires, who worked a lot on this while she was in Ripper. But back in 2019, the Department of Defense actually removed the requirement for military information operations to get chief of mission concurrence before they went out, because for a number of reasons, largely speed, feeling that state was not being a good thing. Between 2020 and 2023, we worked very hard to both get that in place again, and more importantly, to work with our colleagues in DoD to get some real processes set up so that they actually integrate the State Department's perspective. And I'm really happy to say that both of those things have largely happened, right? One, as of this spring, the chief of mission concurrence requirement is back in place. They are required to get affirmative approval from the chief of mission before they proceed with running any military information activities. But more importantly, they're required to consult early and often in the process. They are, right? In part because of something that happened in that interim period, which is the combatant commands that were rigorously engaged thought their programming was better. And all of the evidence we have bears it out that when they work with us, they are better at their work too. And we are often very good at riskier activities that really don't respect some of the principles that I was talking about, right? I think both we and most of our DoD colleagues have seen a lot of advantage in that. It has been, I think, a huge change from where we were 5 or 6 years ago, and all for the good, and ultimately gives us another tool in our toolkit to be able to do the work well.
Great, thank you.
Brian, go ahead.
Just quickly, well, you partially addressed it there. I was going to raise the question of partnerships, because in years past, when we were short of resources and so forth, one thing was to go ask for help.
Yeah.
And get, everybody from the MPAA to EOD and, whoever else to help, so we could send Louis Armstrong, whatever. So You hadn't particularly addressed that, but you just did. But the other thing I wanted to raise is how do you measure success? Because that is how you get money out of Congress.
It sure is.
Good anecdotes reinforced by data.
Yeah, so we generally talk about 5 core types of outcomes that then ladder up to other things. Changes in awareness, changes in attitude, changes in behavior, the formation of relationships, and skills development, right? Because a lot of the programs that we have are not about us conveying or asking someone to do something. It's about empowering them to do something that they want to do. The wonderful thing about those 5 is they all have really well tested social science methodologies for measurement. And then you can figure out how they ladder into a larger strategy. That's what we've done when you look at our evaluations of electoral violence programs or the Young Transatlantic Innovation Leaders Initiative from a couple of years ago. We're measuring against those things using the same sort of research methodologies that everyone else in social science uses. And then we report that to the Hill, and it really helps with resourcing.
I would just mention, we do awards, among other things. And I think many times we don't perhaps give the most modern type of activities, recognition in awards. We perhaps ought to consult someone what the objectives are.
Yeah. Always happy to talk more. I will say that, everything that's old is new again in a lot of forms. And I think a lot of things I have watched as people have argued that things decline in value or are no longer fit for purpose today. And then 5 years later it comes surging back. The 2 that I think about most keenly are cultural programming, which particularly in a post-Ukraine invasion period, I don't think anyone questions the value of. But shortwave radio, we have a lot of places where shortwave radio is coming back as a really, really important form of communication. And I am always just careful to say, oh, that's old stuff, it's not new stuff. Because a lot of times the old stuff is in fact fit for the moment. And we should make sure that we remember how to pull those things out and put them to good use.
Speaking of which, a question,
Yeah.
I'll riff off a bit from the chat room. How do you see AI, or do you see it in the exchanger space as an area for virtual reality work, which actually goes back to a bit of what was attempted a decade ago? Yeah. Right? Do you see that kind of faded away? Do you see that being revived through AI? Is there a mission there?
I mean, I continue to think there's a role for virtual programming. And full disclosure, I worked in the office that did virtual exchanges in ECA. And just for the folks in the room, how many of you have made a new friend online?
I have.
Okay, so like maybe a quarter of us. It's hard for a lot of people to do that. It's just not kind of in our habit. It is in mine because I grew up in a very particular time on the anonymous internet where like that's what people did. But for a lot of people, the internet becomes a way of extending relationships they've already made rather than starting new ones. And I think we just have to be thoughtful about how we do that. I am skeptical of AI being a public-facing tool for the department, in part because it does not sit as well with the core premise that I gave you that we are about building relationships, right? Human relationships. I want to think about how those tools can be used in a low-risk way for our internal work before I want to unleash AI as a tool for kind of building external relationships or external exchanges. I think there's a lot that you can change in the exchange administration. It would be really, really great with AI.
Right. And then a second question, AI is advancing very quickly.
Yeah.
Obviously, a lot of people in the department today aren't familiar with and necessarily comfortable with that. Do you see them being able to quickly come up to speed and not be overwhelmed by it? And do you see it as becoming a criteria both for entry-level exam and for the examination, the,
Yeah.
process.
Yeah, I won't speculate on how our human resource process will go. Because the Foreign Service HR process is always a great mystery, even to the people that work on it. But on the first, one of the first things that Undersecretary Allen set out as a priority for her to work through that our PD practitioners were AI literate and had room to experiment. And they have done that. We can see hundreds of individual experiments running out there with both the official, State Department, ChatGPT software that we have set up, as well as with a lot of tools in a safe and responsible way. I have there is, as I said, certainly a lot of learning and training we need to do. But we started from the moment that these tools were available, and I see people continuing to thrive as we experiment and master them in the days and months ahead.
Good. Maybe one last question, if there is a, Jennifer.
Nice to see you, Paul.
It's good to see you.
Thank you for your talk. I wanted to broach the topic of disinformation.
Yeah.
It is one of the things that makes the current environment more challenging.
Yeah.
And I wanted to go back to something that Primrose talked about in terms of comedy with our other allies and partners. One of the advantages that a couple of our chief competitors have is synchronicity of messaging. I know China better than I know the others, but the Chinese are brilliant at synchronizing messaging from top to bottom, left to right, and all across the globe. We are not good at that. Democratic societies are not good at having one voice. What are some PD best practices for working on synchronicity of messaging, including future-proofing messaging through a transition of power, through another limited resource era? A big question, but I think an important one in the current environment.
Yeah, I certainly do love the propaganda outlets where you can see the same thing being broadcast the same way. But I kind of want to challenge the premise, which is I have seen no evidence that the amount of energy they spend synchronizing those messages actually gets them across into people's heads and better. And actually gets them to stick. When we go back to the awareness, attitude, behavior, I'm not seeing great benefits to them because they have done all of that work on synchronizing across those areas.
I would say there are a lot of benefits to them domestically.
For sure.
Matter for our PD audiences in China, for example.
Yeah, I do not think that if we did that in an environment like China, it would make a particularly great difference. The cost is really great to build synchronicity like that. Starting to lose my fluency in English here. The cost is really great, and I don't see the payoff being there for us. It's certainly an approach that they've pursued, and I think works for some of their goals and not for others. I think in general, the approach that the US tends to pursue, which is audience-specific messages that are well thought through and that come from a place of two-way respect and an understanding of the other party, works pretty much everywhere better than the approach that they take. And it's one that I'm going to continue to bet on because all of the evidence that I have seen suggests that it is.
Okay, well, our 1 hour is already in the rearview mirror. So just want to say thanks, Paul, for a really fascinating program, taking the time to come here. For those here, I think Paul's going to stick around for a few minutes, if only to eat a sandwich. And let me turn it over to our president, Joe Fishman, for closing remarks.
And let me add my thanks to you, Paul. You've given us a grounding on the contemporary fundamentals and where we're going. Left us with a lot of questions. This is not the last that you'll be hearing from us.
I hope not.
Well, I hope not as well. And I want to thank you for your help with us as well. I know you've been helping us with the awards program, and we
have a lot more that we're struggling with, including your comment about the understaffing of public diplomacy, something we're grappling with. We hope to be working with you on that. Your presentation today is the beginning of three things that we'll be getting from leaders, department leaders in public diplomacy, bringing us up to speed so that we are well enough educated to follow through intelligently. There are a lot of thank yous today. First to EDCA Vice President Larry Wallace for conceiving this program and moderating today. To Adam Powell for your partnership and for the wonderful venue that we have today. And to the working group which organized and produced today's events. Ripper's Stacy Williams, and I hope I'm not butchering your name, Fatima Uruchi, Matthew Miller, and Mary Galetti. Judy Kang, Special Project Manager for USC Annenberg Center Programs, run out of this building, sitting over there, and now a PDCA board member. And of course, to PDCA Tuck Fellow Gabby Stahl, on whom we rely on for so much. A recording of today's program will be available on the PDCA website. How long will that take, Mike?
2 days?
2 days. I know I'm going to watch it again. Please note that next month's first Monday will be on July 8th, which is the second Monday due to the July 4th weekend. The July 8th program we're following through, will feature Daniel Kimmage, Principal Deputy Coordinator of the State Department's Global Engagement Center, which you saw on one of the slides, one of Paul's early slides. The program will focus on how the State Department is facing the increasingly dangerous challenge of disinformation, conspiracy theories, and media manipulation from bad actors around the world. Because so many of us will be traveling around that time, this program will be entirely on Zoom. It will be well worth our time to take an hour out of our summer to participate. Check the PDCA website, publicdiplomacy.org, to register. If you cannot find registration information, you're welcome to email me at president@publicdiplomacy.org. Adam, do you have anything you want to add?
No, come again.
Glad all of you could be with us today, here in this room and online. These programs are brought to you by the George Washington University Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication, the USC Annenberg Center on Communication Leadership and Policy, and the Public Diplomacy Council of America. Don't forget July 8th. Goodbye for now.